Last time, Fred Hollenbeck vanished from his workshop and woke in a forest that bent reality. Guided by strange pulses and impossible architecture, he crossed a river that refused to touch him, entered a living structure, and met beings who spoke through silence. They chose him not for brilliance but for balance. Now, Fred begins his training, and the world begins to shift. Chapter 13. The Reentry Silence. The sandstone pulsed, not with light, but with ancient memory. Set into the cliffside near Lake Titicaca, not far from Hayumarca, the doorway known as Aramu Muru had baffled explorers and whispered to locals for centuries. Carved with strange precision, untouched by time or weather, the gate of the gods stood alone in a field of red rock, a threshold to nowhere. Or perhaps, as some believed, to somewhere no one ever returned from. Except tonight someone did. Just past midnight, with the stars hanging low over southern Peru, the doorway shimmered. The vertical T-shaped niche rippled gently, like stone momentarily turned to water. No flash, no rumble, no show. Then Fred stepped through. His body passed effortlessly through ancient stone, like the mountain had inhaled. The shimmer faded. The sandstone stood still again. Just a cliff, just a myth. No one saw, no fanfare, only the silent forest bore witness. Fred glanced once over his shoulder, then turned and walked, past twisted vines, beneath crooked trees, toward the distant lights of Cusco. The world had changed, and so had its representative. Chapter 14. The Silent Return. Fred moved through the Cusco night unnoticed, not because he snuck, not because he disguised himself, because he simply did not register. To those nearby, he was atmospheric, like a chill in the air or the scent of rain on warm stone. A presence dismissed the moment it brushed the edge of awareness. At the airport, his steps were steady. Security checkpoints loomed. Announcements echoed overhead in Spanish and Quechua, but Fred didn't stop. He didn't speak. Instead, his mind, tuned through years of training in communion and calibration, radiated intent. You see nothing unusual. This man is allowed. He belongs here. The gate agent blinked once and nodded. No questions, no records, just quiet approval. The attendant printed a boarding pass with no name on it, handed it to Fred like she'd known him all her life, and turned away. Even the metal detectors hummed benignly as Fred passed. He took a window seat on a northbound red-eye. The cabin bathed in soft, artificial dawn. Fellow passengers dozed. A baby babbled softly across the aisle, then stopped, staring at Fred with ancient recognition. Fred offered a slight smile. The child giggled, then slept. When the flight landed in Calgary, the terminal was washed in sterile light and weary bodies. Canada had aged in his absence. Glass towers leaned sharper, machines spoke louder. Yet Fred moved through it like fog curling around lampposts. The customs line was long, winding beneath glowing signs and biometric scanners. Fred walked past them all. No alarms, no challenge, no scans. He touched nothing. His footsteps registered on no sensor. The cameras above flickered briefly, each lens catching a blur, then static, then silence. When he exited the terminal into brisk Alberta morning air, he exhaled deeply. He was home, but the world hadn't noticed. Not yet. Chapter 15. The Long Walk Home. Spring, British Columbia. Fred begins on the outskirts of Vancouver, his boots worn but mind sharp. He helps a mechanic in Kamloops fix a carburetor by levitating the broken part to inspect it, without speaking a word. A wildfire threatens a small logging town. Fred uses his ability to redirect wind and shift falling embers away from homes. A child missing in the woods is found gently curled against Fred in a mossy clearing. The child says he followed the humming man. Summer, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. In Banff, Fred repairs a fence flattened by a bear while the farmer watches from his porch, too stunned to ask how. He shares a silent moment with an injured golden retriever near Drumheller, easing its pain and coaxing it back to health. Near Regina, he finds a broken-down pickup truck and gently nudges the engine to life. The woman driving offers him water. He accepts it with a bow. Autumn, Manitoba and Ontario. A Thunder Bay greets him with falling leaves and rising tension. A neighborhood feud over land. Fred rearranges stones one night, shifting property lines to their peaceful origins. The feud ends the next morning. In a Toronto alley, a man overdoses. Fred kneels, places a hand on his chest, and the man's heart steadies. He stares into Fred's eyes and sobs. Fred rides a canoe down a portion of Georgian Bay, guiding a lost teen back to their camp by starlight. No words, only presence. Chapter 16. Echoes and Embers. Winter, Quebec, the Maritimes, and Newfoundland. Near Montreal, Fred repairs a frozen water line with a flick of his mind. The family inside never sees him, only notices water flowing again at dawn. In New Brunswick, he shelters in a barn and heals a horse's fractured leg with light pressure and intention. On Prince Edward Island, a fisherman's nets are full again after Fred watches silently from shore one morning. In Nova Scotia, a woman grieving her husband feels a presence at her kitchen table. Fred listens without judgment, his silence louder than any platitude. Newfoundland, the end of the road. In a snowstorm near St. John's, Fred vanishes for a week. When he reappears, his beard is flecked with ice, his body lean. The local paper notes strange footprints outside a rescue hut. On the final evening, Fred stands atop Cape Spear, wind howling around him. He watches the Atlantic churn below. He doesn't fly. He doesn't vanish. He walks back inland. He is 72 now. Not tired, transformed. Chapter 17. Threads of the Republic. Fred entered the U.S. through northern Maine, crossing the border with a flick of his mind as sensors dimmed and guards forgot to glance his way. At 72, his beard now silvered in places, Fred looked like a drifter, but radiated the stillness of someone who no longer needed words. New England, mist and motion. In rural Vermont, Fred helped an elderly man whose solar array had malfunctioned. With a touch and a thought, the panels realigned and the lights flickered back on. In Boston, he passed a busy cafe where a child was choking. With a simple gesture from across the street, Fred calmed the panic and the child's airway cleared, as if the blockage had simply decided to move. The Rust Belt and Appalachia, echoes in brick. Fred entered Pennsylvania by foot, resting in a decommissioned steel mill. That night, he dreamt in blueprints, and by morning had repurposed scrap into a fire pit that later became the site of weekly community gatherings. In West Virginia, he helped a woman stuck halfway down a ravine. Her dog had jumped and fallen, and Fred scrambled down without hesitation. Dog healed, woman unharmed, no words exchanged. The South, heat and hearts. In Alabama, Fred walked past a levee project struggling under bureaucratic delay. Overnight, the machinery seemed to fix itself. The foreman, who swore he'd seen a figure silhouetted in moonlight, called it a miracle. In Louisiana, Fred wandered into a bayou where a fisherman's son had gone missing. Guided by the rhythm of frogs and wind, Fred found the boy asleep under a cypress, soothed by a mysterious hum only Fred seemed to understand. Texas, wires and bones. Fred entered a border town where cell phone towers blinked erratically, disrupting communication. He climbed one silently at dawn and, with a minor burst of kinetic energy, realigned key components. Service returned. The local tech team never noticed the change. He left no photos, only rumors. Chapter 18. Crosswinds and Signal Fires. The American West began in New Mexico, where Fred stood at the edge of a desert and watched a monsoon swallow the horizon. The Four Corners, spirit and dust. Fred meditated near Shiprock, and local Dini elders felt his presence without seeing him. That night, a sick lamb recovered after an elder dreamt of a soft-breathed man who walked the stars. Arizona and Nevada, sparks in shadow. In Flagstaff, Fred walked through a mechanic's garage where a classic Thunderbird refused to start. He tapped the hood twice, engine coughed, then roared. In Las Vegas, Fred ignored the casinos entirely. He found a homeless vet sleeping near a drainage tunnel and quietly left a folded poncho, fresh water, and a packet of jerky beside him. The vet woke weeping. California, tremors and light. In LA, Fred walked straight through a digital art museum without a ticket. One sensor caught him, but the frame glitched and no alarm sounded. That night, the display lights recalibrated and projected a series of ethereal patterns unseen in the original programming. In Big Sur, a wild fox approached Fred as he rested beside a redwood. They stared at each other a long time before the fox curled up beside him. The final steps, the Pacific coast. Fred reached the edge at Point Reyes, the Pacific folding sky into sea. He stood silently on the bluffs, wind curling around his coat. Somewhere below, a tide shifted against the rocks like a new thought. He had seen America not through news or policy but through people, through healing and pattern, through what needed fixing and what asked only to be seen. Fred was not yet ready to reveal himself, but the world was beginning to notice the presence of something calm, something quiet, something changing. Chapter 19. The Watchers and the Way Home. Fred was nearing Blaine, Washington, the sky a steel gray cut by gull calls and the distant hum of traffic. He'd been walking mostly at night, not out of fear but out of courtesy. His presence stirred things, and he didn't want to disturb what didn't need disturbing. Then he saw it. A black SUV, parked, idle, windows tinted like obsidian. Fred slowed only imperceptibly and felt them before he confirmed it. Two men inside, standard issue field agents, nervous, intent, wearing calm like a disguise. The first glimpse. Fred turned his head slightly, not to look but to acknowledge. One of the agents twitched, no movement visible, but Fred felt it. The way a bird might feel a change in the wind. He kept walking, but shadows began to shift around him. Not literal shadows but possibilities, alternate paths he could slip into, identities he could borrow, frequencies he could hum his way out on. Still, he stayed in the open. Government files begin to unfold. In Ottawa, a woman in cybersecurity flipped through grainy footage. There, she said, pausing on frame 1067. A figure passed through a locked gate without touching it. In Langley, Virginia, someone reviewed reports from Montana and Louisiana. Solar panels, levees, missing persons found. All disparate threads, but a pattern began forming. He was given no name, just a project code, whisper pattern. Fred's next move. That night, Fred camped behind a diner off Interstate 5. He didn't need food, but he warmed himself near their waste oil burner out of kindness to the cold. The SUV never left. Another joined it by dawn. Fred stood, brushed dust from his coat, and walked straight into the open. The agents stepped out, not guns drawn but hands heavy near holsters. They said nothing. Fred nodded, then shifted, not disappearing, but becoming what the eye doesn't register. His shape blurred, his presence thinned. The agents froze, eyes wide. Then Fred was gone. Only steps away, watching them from behind a telephone pole that suddenly felt more there than before. He didn't want to run, but he did need time. Time to finish crossing the border. Time to prepare. They weren't ready. Chapter 20. Echoes in the Dominion. Fred stood mere feet from the Canadian border, a mist curling through the pines. Across the boundary line, two black SUVs idled silently, their matte finish barely catching the gray light. He had felt the agents long before he saw them. Canadian intelligence. Different training. Slower pulses, but just as sharp. The crossing. Fred didn't hesitate. He shifted not into invisibility, but into irrelevance. He became a flicker in peripheral vision, the dust that clings to camera lenses, the momentary lapse in memory. He stepped across the border. Yet this time, someone noticed. In a data center in Gatineau, a security analyst blinked at a thermal anomaly. No body, no object, just a single drop in pressure and a timestamp. She sent a quiet flag to her supervisor. Internal code, Northern Vale. The journey begins. Fred was now in British Columbia. His mission: visit each Canadian capital, quietly altering the undercurrents of what was broken. He didn't seek power. He sought balance. Capitals in his path. City, province/territory. Moment of change. Victoria, British Columbia. A crowded ER saw its systems inexplicably synchronize after Fred walked past the main server hub. Edmonton, Alberta. A flood alert system recalibrated just in time to prevent a false alarm that would have caused mass panic. Regina, Saskatchewan. A grassroots food distribution network found its logistics mysteriously optimized overnight. Winnipeg, Manitoba. A troubled youth center reported an anonymous donation. Untraceable, except the delivery note read, "Stay warm. Stay strong." Toronto, Ontario. Traffic systems glitched green in sequence during rush hour, cutting commute times in half for one extraordinary evening. Quebec City, Quebec. A power outage that should have lasted hours blinked back to life in minutes. Local techs called it spontaneous grid resurrection. Halifax, Nova Scotia. A mural appeared overnight on a crumbling wall. A white fox beside a northern man with star-strewn eyes. No artist claimed it. Fredericton, New Brunswick. A deaf woman heard music for the first time at a bus station. No radio was present. Fred had sat nearby. Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. A lone lighthouse, disused for decades, lit up for one night. Fishermen swore it saved 2 boats in the fog. St. John's, Newfoundland. A man found his missing daughter after following a trail of glowing pebbles in the woods. The trail vanished by dawn. Whitehorse, Yukon. Northern lights pulsed over the town for 10 extra seconds after Fred passed beneath them. Phones didn't record it. Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. A drilling operation halted after a worker dreamt of a man urging them to wait one more day. The next day revealed a fault line. Iqaluit, Nunavut. A polar bear calf, orphaned and stranded, approached the town unafraid. Fred met it at the edge and turned it gently away, whispering in no known language. Final whisper. Fred moved quickly, light on his feet, but every step resonated like thunder in hushed corridors. He knew they would follow. He knew someone was building a profile. He was no longer a myth. Now he was a pattern. Chapter 21. The Second Descent. Fred re-entered the United States through Montana. No checkpoints, no announcements. The earth simply let him pass. At 73, his white beard caught the prairie wind like a weather vane. But his gait was steady, younger than it had any right to be. He moved through the country like an echo. Wherever he went, change followed. The SUVs multiply. In Bozeman, a black SUV idled outside a bakery just before Fred arrived. He walked in, repaired the broken oven with a glance, and left before the agents could finish their coffee. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, he passed a broken windmill. By morning it turned steadily again. A second SUV had been parked nearby, agents inside, scanning, recording. They left confused. By the time Fred reached Denver, there were 4 vehicles, each parked strategically, each failing to intercept him. Cameras glitched. Motion sensors misfired. One agent swore he saw Fred ripple like heat off asphalt, then vanish into a bus terminal without boarding a bus. The Whisper Pattern Task Force was officially activated. Reports stacked like cards. One analyst wrote, "He doesn't move. He unfolds." The quiet healings continue. In Kansas City, Fred fixed a hearing aid for a man at a park by simply sitting next to him for 5 minutes. Near Oklahoma City, a horse with a twisted tendon ran freely the morning after Fred passed the stable. In Austin, a community garden saw a week's growth overnight. No fertilizer, just presence. Twists in the silence. In New Orleans, Fred entered a jazz club mid-set and sat quietly in the back. The saxophone player swore he felt someone syncing with his rhythm, not playing, just resonating. In Mississippi, a mother's grief lifted after her child's drawing, left on a windowsill, blew away, and returned the next day folded into an origami fox. She never saw who brought it back. The mind flickers. Fred sensed the agents now, not just behind him but inside their intentions. Some were scared, some intrigued. One, in Phoenix, began meditating after tracking Fred and reported feeling seen from somewhere inside his head. They never touched him, never spoke. Fred let them observe. But he chose the road. And the road, in turn, chose him. Chapter 22. The Waiter by the Border. Fred approached the edge of the desert, where the scrub brush thinned and the wind grew still. The horizon shimmered not with heat, but with awareness. He saw him, just one man, standing near a rusted fence post, dressed plainly, faded jeans and old flannel, no badge, no logo, hands resting at his sides. His eyes never left Fred's, but they weren't searching. They were simply witnessing. Fred felt no tension, no urgency, just readiness, the silent presence. Fred stopped 5 feet from him. The man spoke first, not in greeting, just a low-toned statement. "You took longer than I expected." Fred nodded. "I never hurry." They stood there in the hush. Who he is? The man's name was Ellis. Not a spy, not an official. Fred could tell Ellis wasn't from anywhere, or maybe he'd been from everywhere once. Ellis had worked odd jobs across borders. Bridge repair, orchard planting, storm cleanup. He never stayed long, but always left something better. He once sat with a man who'd lost speech from trauma, and after an hour, the man spoke again. Ellis just listened. No miracle, just presence. He'd seen Fred once before, years back, from a distance, a blur in a snowstorm that melted footprints as they formed. Ellis had waited not to intercept but to offer. He didn't ask questions. He asked for nothing. Only this, "Would you walk a while with me?" And Fred, for the first time in years, said, "Yes." Chapter 23. Two Who Walk Between. Ellis and Fred walked side by side, their steps soft against the gravel shoulder of a road that rarely saw travelers on foot. Shadows stretched long in the late summer sun, curling like quiet punctuation beneath their stride. They spoke, but never with urgency. Conversation flowing like river water, deep and undisturbed, about balance and the fragility of intention, about entropy and how some places collapse from forgetting, not neglect, about humanity's hum, how each city has a rhythm, and when it breaks, people feel it in their bones. They helped as they walked. A woman in Bellingham sobbing over a locked phone with her late son's voice trapped inside. Ellis held the device for a moment. It unlocked itself, the last message blinking softly. A dog limping near a skate park. Fred crouched, touched its paw, and it ran off moments later, tail wagging like a stitched kite. An elderly man on his porch in a forgotten neighborhood, who hadn't spoken in years. The moment the two passed by, he whispered, "They're here." The border crossing. The line of demarcation loomed ahead, silent, patrolled, waiting. 2 black SUVs were parked at opposite ends, like sentinels whose orders had grown stale. The agents inside stared into screens, murmuring code phrases, eyes trained on patterns no longer reliable. Fred slowed. Ellis tilted his head slightly, smiled. They walked forward, no rush, no veil, no disguise. They passed the first SUV. Inside, 2 agents sat alert, fingers twitching near biometric controls. Fred and Ellis walked directly into their line of sight. But the agents did not see. The moment of crossing echoed like a subtle chord struck in a distant room. Someone did see. High above, tucked inside a fiber-fed observation center buried beneath a government outpost, a single operator jolted upright. Her screen flickered once. 2 figures walked across a span of ground that shimmered, not visibly, but in magnetic trace. Her instruments pulsed irregularly, then steadied. She stared at the feed. Fred, Ellis. No names. No known biometrics. But the signature matched, one from a missing thermal trace recorded years ago in Peru. The system tagged it, Thread Surge #0029B. She didn't alert command. She waited, because she'd been watching too. Chapter 24. Signals in the grain. The road bent north, tracing the rim of forgotten farmland. Wheat fields waved like drowsy listeners, catching pieces of their conversation. Above, clouds hung low, reflecting silver veins that almost, but not quite, formed patterns. Neither Fred nor Ellis spoke of the crossing. Not yet. But Fred noticed Ellis's silence held a new tension, like he was listening to something other than words. The operator waits. Far away, in the underground observation center, the woman leaned forward. Her screen showed nothing out of place now, just gravel, crops, occasional birds. But she didn't look at the live feed anymore. She opened a locked file. Thread surge #0011P. It had only one entry. Subject disappeared near a river in Alberta. Signature linked to metallic distortion. Reappearance undocumented. Subject left behind a vessel of unknown propulsion origin. The vessel, Fred's punt. She hadn't made the connection until Ellis. Two walkers. Same frequency. Conversations without context. That evening, Fred asked gently, "Do you feel it? The way things lean around us?" Ellis looked toward the horizon. A grain elevator glowed briefly in twilight. "I do," he said. "I just don't know why." Fred knew what it felt like when a truth hovered nearby, not ready to land. So they let it be, and walked. Chapter 25. The Third Quiet Eye. She was out of place, even in her stillness. The co-op in Killam was closed for the evening, shelves lit by the amber glow of old fluorescent tubes and the hum of refrigeration. Locals had gone home. The streets had settled into quiet, cracked pavement and distant coyote song. But she stood there, calm, intent, not confused, not lost, just waiting. Ellis saw her first. "She's waiting for us," he murmured. Fred nodded slowly. "Yep, I suppose she is at that." They walked without urgency. Her gaze was fixed down the block, as if watching the flicker of a gas station sign in the dark. She didn't notice them until they stood within her shadow. She blinked once, then said, "I wasn't sure you'd come this way, but I hoped you would." Not government, something older. Inside the small cafe, with chipped mugs and a pinball machine that hadn't worked since 1993, she began to speak. Not through protocol, through presence. Her name was Marin. She wasn't with the Canadian government, nor with any known agency. She belonged to a fifth observer group called the Third Quiet Eye. "We're not official," she said. "But we've been watching longer than most, longer than satellites, longer than programs." They weren't formed from policy or politics. They emerged after a series of anomalies in the 1970s. Things that couldn't be buried or explained. A structure that vanished from aerial photos but remained visible to hikers. A man in Newfoundland who repaired failing radio towers by touching them and walking away. An old woman in Nunavut whose visions of solar flares predicted outages more accurately than any instrument. Marin was one of four still active. She had come not to arrest or expose, but to understand. Fred studied her while stirring black coffee with a bent spoon. Ellis watched the window as shadows elongated and shifted unnaturally. "We think you're doing something more than fixing things," Marin said. "We think you're stabilizing reality." Fred said nothing. Ellis leaned back, face unreadable. "You don't have to tell me what you are," she said softly. "Just let me walk with you for a while." Fred finally spoke. "We're heading east." Marin nodded. "Good. That's where the next rupture is." End of episode 2. Two who walk between. Now joined by one who listens.